When I asked for the date, the bride didn't blink. She tipped her head, let a dry little laugh escape, and said, "We did it last night. Just our people." Her name was Sienna, a name like perfume, all glide and shine. The kitchen clock behind her clicked once and went on with its business. My fingers tightened around the laminate edge of her counter so I wouldn't reach for anything I might throw. For a breath, I thought I'd misheard. 72 years is long enough for sound to wander. "Excuse me," I said, even though I'd understood every syllable. Intimate last minute, she repeated slower sugar over something sharp. We wanted it to feel curated. Curated. As if love were a display you set behind glass. I stood there, the smell of lemon cleaner and ground coffee stitched into the air, while my mind buckled the pale dress in my closet, still wearing its store tag. The low heels waiting in their box, the envelope tucked in my purse. 8 crisp hundreds and a small card that said, "For your beginning, Mom." I'd already told my sister Rita in Phoenix to expect photographs. I'd already pressed Luke's birth bracelet to my lips that morning, a ritual I'd never confessed to anyone. Luke wasn't looking at me. My son, 35 shoulders he hadn't earned at a desk. Hands that still remembered a bicycle handlebar sat on Sienna's new sofa, watching a point somewhere near his shoelaces. I knew those floorboards. I had paid the contractor who'd laid them. He rubbed his palms on his jeans, a boy caught out and already practicing not to care. "I see," I said. The words tasted like pennies. I set my pocketbook on the counter and turned to the window over the sink. Out there, winter sun made a white seam along the edge of the street. The small lake cabin across town's cedar siding shallow porch flashed into my mind the way memories do when they're half dream. I had imagined birthdays there. I had imagined small feet slapping the boards and a pie cooling without anyone asking who bought the butter. People say stories like mine are ordinary. They are. That is why they matter. After Martin died, my husband with the crooked tie and the steady laugh, I stepped into the double shift of being mother and roof. I took extra hours at the clinic front desk, typed after midnight for a tax firm. Every March, skipped coats until the lining of the old one showed thread. When Luke and Sienna moved into their 2-bedroom, the rent slipped high and stayed there, and I slipped my hand under it like a jack to keep the car from crushing them. Month after month, I told myself we were temporary. Temporary has a way of becoming a calendar. I paid the deposit on their refrigerator when the old one died with a wet, rude sigh. I covered 3 electric bills in a row. The winter the furnace had the flu. I topped up their phones just this once 7 times. I drove to a tire shop before dawn because Sienna had called from an on-ramp in tears, and Luke had left his wallet in yesterday's coat. I listened to my own stomach argue with itself while I handed cash across a counter, and I said out loud like a fool in a parking lot, "This is what love does." On Sienna's hand, the ring I recognized found the window's thin light and threw it back. I had paid the deposit on that too, not the whole thing. Of course I'm not a magician, but enough to turn the jeweler from a no to a yes. I had bought the gray sofa because theirs was too college. I had bought a shelving unit Sienna showed me on her phone because it would make the space feel grown. "Evelyn, don't be offended," Sienna said now. She liked my name when she wanted to smooth something. It was small. It was special. Special. The word found my ribs and pressed. Luke's mouth tensed. A muscle jumped near his eye. He still didn't look at me. "Congratulations," I managed. My voice surprised me by staying level. I picked up my pocketbook and left it where it had been, as if announcing I wasn't fleeing. "You'll want to call your uncle," I said, because I couldn't think of a single sentence that didn't feel like a cry. I drove home slow, the radio off. My little bungalow on Auburn Street greeted me with its familiar draft at the threshold and the smell of paper and tea. I set my bag down, hung my keys on the crooked nail Martin had hammered in place 20 years ago, and stood in the quiet until the quiet began to feel like air again. A few days later, my phone rang. I let it sing twice. On the third note, I picked up. Evelyn, Sienna's voice thinner now, the sweet scraped off. A reminder the property tax on the cabin. "We're past due. Could you handle that today?" For a heartbeat, I saw her lips form curated. I saw Luke's eyes practicing the floor. Something old inside me, compliance reflex, a woman's well-trained reach for her purse, stepped forward, then stopped. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before my manners could betray me. I made dinner the way I always do. Egg toast and apple cut into quarters like I used to for Luke when his front teeth were gone. I washed the plate, set it in the rack to drip, wiped the counter in light circles until there was nothing left to clean and too much left to feel. Then I opened the drawer where I kept a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil with a silent click. Numbers do not flatter, they do not console, they stand there and tell you what you've done. At the top of the page, I wrote neat as ledger script, 3 years, Luke and Sienna. Rent gap. I wrote that phrase as if naming it could embarrass it into shrinking 800 here, 300 there, 4 months straight the year he freelanced and the firm forgot to send checks. I drew 36 squares down the margin and put a tick in too many of them. I carried the one. $48 is $600. Saying the number aloud made it real, so I said it. Utilities and Wi-Fi winters are bullies in this town. 3.E. Groceries mine and not mine. Rotisserie chickens in bags. Too heavy for my wrists. The year's arthritis. Learned its alphabet. $4,900. Medical and mishaps urgent care copay when Luke's ear went hot and mean. Dental crown Sienna couldn't chew without. A wrist brace I left on their table like a napkin. $1.150. Car 2 tires, 1 alternator that gave up outside a pharmacy, 1 battery that only believed in summer, $1,650. Furniture and ring deposit and making it grow in the sofa, the shelves that glint, $2,800. Cabin tax, the place I had imagined would belong to our Sundays, $2,400 each year for 2 years and will cover the next that never came, $4,800. I pressed the pencil harder than the paper deserved and drew a line. 67 $80. A number like a door you can't pretend is a wall. On a second column I wrote what banks don't bother with time. Early mornings shifting small sums between accounts so available would mean what it said by 9. Invitations declined with cheerful lies because deposits loom. The bus trip to the coast, I didn't take the church retreat I told myself I'd do next spring, when next is something that keeps its coat on and waits outside. Pride swallowed until it tasted like metal. Memory has its own bookkeeping. I saw Luke at 9 grass in his socks, cheeks flushed, flinging himself toward me after a soccer game, the neon jersey bright as a citrus fruit. "You're the best mom," he'd said full voice, no irony. I set that sentence on the page not as a balance, but as proof that love once stood here steady and alive. Across from me, Martin's chair waited in its old place by the table. The wood had a shine where his right hand used to rest, the shape polished by 1,000 small pauses. If he had been there, he would have cleared his throat the way he did when truth wanted room. Enough, he would have said. Not angry, not cruel, just the one word he used when something needed to stop being heavy and start being true. I turned back to my column and added one last entry in letters larger than the rest, because small letters have a way of pretending they aren't important. Respect received. I laid the pencil down. The house had grown so quiet I could hear the absurd little cluck of the baseboard heater turning itself on and off. On the counter, the kettle breathed white for a moment and settled. I did not cry. I didn't have to. The math had done what it came to do. I slid the pad into the drawer, the paper still warm under my palm as if it had a pulse. I washed my cup and set it to dry beside the plate. I stood a long time with both hands on the edge of my kitchen table, the wood worn honey-smooth by years of meals and bills and school permission slips. Then I pulled out the chair across from Martin's and sat down in the place he would have chosen for me, the one facing the window. Outside, the street kept its small winter light. Inside, my name was still mine. The ledger slept in the drawer, but it changed the air. I woke before the streetlights blinked out, made coffee in the blue pot Martin liked, because it sounded like rain when it poured, and stood with my hands around the mug until the heat stopped arguing with the morning. The legal pad waited behind the forks. When I slid the drawer open, the pages rustled like something alive. The last line stared back, respect received, o plain as a label on a jar. It was funny what the truth could do without raising its voice. I dressed as if for a dentist appointment. Wool skirt jacket that still held its shape, low heels. I could negotiate while carrying paper. The bank on Riverton had not changed since the year Luke learned to sign his name. The same potted tree near the entrance, the same framed photograph of the river in spring, the same cleanness to the light that made numbers feel behaved. The branch manager, Mr. Pierce, stood when I knocked on the doorframe of his glass office. He was 60 if he was a day, with a careful part in his hair and a face that had practiced both sympathy and restraint. "Mrs. Hart," he said, voice church, soft. "What can we do for you this morning? Another transfer?" "No," I said, taking the chair. The cushion sighed. "I've come to stop them. All of them." He watched me for a long second. That wasn't impolite. "Are you sure?" I wrote it down, I answered. That made me sure. He nodded like a man who'd been waiting for the right word to appear, and now it had. He turned to the keyboard and typed with 2 steady index fingers. The screen reflected in his lenses scheduled payments to a landlord whose name I knew from envelopes, automatic deposits to an account with Luke's name, attached to Sienna's little seasonal pieces I'd told myself were kindness. Paper slid out of a printer with the soft gasps of a person learning to breathe. He arranged the pages with more care than such pages usually receive, then turned them so they faced me. "Initial here and here," he said. "Then sign and date at the bottom, and again on the final page. This cancels every standing authorization connected to those recipients." I picked up the pen. The weight felt right. Evelyn Hart in the first blank. The loop of the Y came easy. With each set of letters, the rope inside my chest slackened a small measure the way it does when you finally step out of a dress that's been too tight all evening, but you told yourself looked fine. The clock above his door moved a single minute forward. Somewhere behind the counter, a coin tray chimed. When I'd finished, Mr. Pierce collected the stack and tapped the edges square. If they attempt to run future drafts, the system will refuse them, he said. And if you receive any calls about renewal authorizations, tell them to call me. He slid a business card across Pierce, in clean type, a direct line written by his own pen. You've been a faithful customer a long time. You don't owe anyone an explanation for what you choose to stop. Walking out through the glass doors, the winter sun landed on my face hard enough to make me blink. I stood there a moment on the steps without moving the way you do after stepping from a dim hallway into noon. I wasn't lighter in any storybook way. I was simply more vertical, as if someone had returned a small piece of my spine. On Auburn Street I parked, crooked corrected, then corrected again. The house took me in the way it always had draft, at the baseboard scent of cedar from the closet where Martin's coat still lived folded in moth paper, a light scuff on the kitchen floor from years of chairs being pulled back by hands in a hurry. I set my bag down and stared at the door. The brass knob shone with the touch of more hands than mine. In the bowl on the entry table lay a tangle of keys. I had never sorted the mail key to the box we'd surrendered, an old gym key that locked nothing a spare to a car I no longer owned. There might as well have been a welcome mat that read, "Come whenever you want." I took the spare from the bowl and dropped it in the trash with a sound so small it felt indecent. Then I put on my coat and drove to Barrow's Hardware. The bell on the door talked like a memory. The aisles smelled of oil and lumber and new rope. A young man with a notch shaved into his eyebrow looked up from a shelf of doorknobs and smiled the polite way. Boys smile at ladies who remind them of their grandmothers and also of rules. His name tag said Noah. "I need a lock," I said, and heard how unremarkable that sentence sounded. He led me to a display of deadbolts that promised more than some husbands ever had: pick-resistant, drill-resistant, anti-bump, tamper-proof. He set 2 boxes on the counter. "This one's good," he said, tapping a brass cylinder. "This one's a tank." His hand moved to the heavy brushed steel. I picked up the second box and felt the weight in my palm. The key it came with looked unapologetic. "I'll take the tank," I said. Back home, I spread the instructions on the kitchen table and read them twice through, even the parts that men like to skip because they think they've been born able to hang doors. The old plate unscrewed with a sigh, as if grateful to be relieved of duty. I worked carefully, not fast, because careful is its own speed. I pried the cylinder loose and dropped it into the trash beside the spare key. When the new deadbolt finally seated, I tightened the last screw until it had nothing left to give. The first turn of a new key is a ceremony without witnesses. I stood with my left hand on the cool face of the door and turned the metal with my right. The bolt slid home with a clean, decisive click that sounded like punctuation in a sentence that had run on too long. I stood there a while with the key between my fingers and the house around me holding its small breath. That night, I slept through without waking to check my phone for blinking lights. Morning laid itself along the windowsills like paper. The kettle stuttered, breathed, calmed. I was scrubbed clean tired, the kind that comes after you've done the job you'd been dodging. I washed sheets, folded towels, opened the cabinet where Martin's old pipe still kept its ghost of sweet smoke, and laughed at myself for being sentimental about a man who never once remembered where he put his wrench, but always knew exactly where to find my hand. It was afternoon when I stepped into the yard to shake a rug, and the cold walked down my throat. I stood there listening to the thin, leaf-brittle sound of the maple and watched a boy on a bike run over the same patch of sidewalk twice to learn how to ride it smoother. When I came back in and turned toward the living room, I stopped. 3 people sat in my house as if they'd been born there. Luke on the sofa, elbows on his knees the way he sat when the school counselor told us his teachers wanted him to apply himself. Sienna perched upright beside him wearing the cream coat she saved for residency interviews and any conversation that needed authority, and a man I didn't know, mid-40s, suit too tidy to be local, occupying Martin's chair without apology. The rug in my hands went slack. "How did you get in?" Sienna smoothed her skirt. "Side door code," she said, bright as cutlery. "You never changed it." She was right. The garage keypad had been numbers Luke picked when he was 10, his favorite player's jersey, and the year of some movie. I had changed a bolt and left a green-painted door wide open. "Mom," Luke began, and I heard where he'd put me. Not the mother you tell news to, not the mother you bring flowers to, but the syllable you aim at a wall. "We were worried. You weren't answering." "We thought it would be good to talk face to face." The stranger stood and offered his hand. "Adam Hale," he said, "Palms Professional. I'm an attorney. Your son and daughter-in-law asked me to help them help you." I didn't take his hand. He let it fall without losing his smile. He lifted a leather folder from his briefcase and set a stack of papers on the coffee table Luke had eaten cereal over when he was 9. "It's a limited power of attorney," he said. Temporary, strictly administrative. While you're under stress, it ensures bills are paid and obligations aren't missed. Obligations, Sienna echoed as if tasting a new word she'd like us to adopt. We know you've had a lot on your mind. You canceled some transfers and you've been difficult to reach. Sit, Mom, Luke said, patting the cushion as if I needed the invitation to a chair I'd bought. We're on your side. I walked in. I set the rug across the back of the armchair the stranger had stood up from, then took the straight-back chair by the window instead. This is my house, I said. We'll speak at my table. Sienna gathered the papers unruffled and followed me. Luke trailed eyes on his shoes the way they'd been on Sienna's sofa. At the table, the attorney fanned the document so the signature line faced me. He produced a pen that wanted to be admired. Mrs. Hart, he said, settling into a voice that had been a class in law school and before that, a habit in high school debate. A limited financial POA simply gives your designees the right to act if you forget a due date or misplace a statement. You retain ultimate control. Think of it as a seatbelt. I've been driving longer than you've been alive, I said. I know how seatbelts work. He smiled unbothered. People feel better when they don't have to carry everything. Let your family shoulder some of the burden. Luke nodded like a man who had rehearsed that exact nod in the car. We love you, he said to the table. We want to keep things smooth. Sienna aligned the corners of the stack. It's also protection, she said, not looking at me in case someone tries to take advantage. You'd be surprised what can happen at your age. At my age. The phrase reached across the table and tried to settle on my shoulders the way a cat settles on a lap that belongs to someone else. I looked past Hale's neat tie to the lamplight slanting across the wood and saw as clearly as I saw my hands the drawer with the legal pad inside it. Respect received 0. Numbers are unflirtatious creatures. They stand their ground. So could I. If you believe I cannot manage my affairs, I said, calm enough to make the words fit through a narrow place, find a judge. Evelyn, Luke said quickly, color rising, this is not. Sienna cut him a glance that would have withered a plant. Let's not make this adversarial, she said, turning to me with a smile too careful. We're trying to reduce stress, not escalate it. The landlord has been asking questions. The cabin tax is overdue. The car insurance lapsed last month. These things add up. They do, I said. I wrote them down. Hale placed his pen on the line again with the elegant patience of a man about to sign for a parcel. No one is taking anything from you, he said, as if he'd been assigned to read the sentence. We're simply ensuring continuity. I canceled continuity this morning, I said. Silence sat down with us, a fourth participant. The refrigerator in the kitchen hummed and hushed. Outside, a delivery truck coughed a box onto a neighbor's porch. Hale's smile thinned, recalculating. Sienna laced her fingers together as if prayer might present itself as a persuasive tool. Luke stared at his hands the way he used to when he'd come home with a detention slip and needed the countertop to blur. Mom, he tried again, softer. We can't keep patching things when there's no system. Rent insurance, the cabin we're juggling. If you let us help, it all stays steady. Help, I said quietly and tasted the shape of that word in my mouth. I've done that. For 3 years. Sienna's face moved a small tick near her eye as if a cord had tightened. You're being unkind, she said. We're here because we care. I reached for the stack. The paper would have slid to me easily if Hale's hand hadn't stayed a second too long. He moved it late, but not rude. I lifted the weight of their request and held it against my chest, the way a person holds a brick to remember what a wall is made of. Then I set the stack down beside the fruit bowl and spoke as evenly as I could. If you want this signed, I said, bring me a court order with a judge's name on it. Hale's practiced patience cracked at the edge. Mrs. Hart, with respect, the court tends to view these matters more favorably if families work together informally first, rather than litigate them into something they don't have to become. I am the family, I said. Not loud, not dramatic. The level tone you use to tell a contractor where the property line lies. This house is mine. This table is mine. This signature is mine. If you think I'm not fit to use it, you may test that belief in a courtroom. Luke pushed back his chair so fast the legs scraped a line into the floor I would see every time I mopped. Why are you doing this? He burst, anger and hurt, braided tight. We are your people. I looked at my son, the face I knew in its baby roundness and its adolescent angles and its adult reluctance to be seen. Are you? I asked and let the question sit there without a decoration. His mouth shut. His jaw flickered. Somewhere inside him something braced and something else sat down. Sienna stood smoothing her coat with both palms, and the move said more than any sentence she could have chosen. We'll consult, she said to Hale as if I weren't present. To me, she added, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Hard, I said, is a door that lets itself be opened by anyone who knows an old code. Her eyes landed on the hallway where the keypad lived, and then came back to my face with a flash that would have been respect if it had been shaped differently. She gathered her purse. Hale slid the unsigned document back into his folder with a quiet, disappointed whisper the sound of a plan being refiled. Luke stood last, his chair stubborn, and for a heartbeat I thought he might look at me the way he used to when he was 8 and sorry. He didn't. He stared at the wall over my shoulder as if some solution might be written there in lemon cleaner. At the door, I said, "I'll walk you out." On the porch, the cold had turned fine as flour and just as dry. I stepped past them to the edge of the steps. The hedge across the walk held a scatter of sparrows like punctuation. Sienna's car idled at the curb, resigned. Hale offered his hand again, not insistently this time, but with a courtesy he hadn't spent yet. I let it pass a second time, not to be rude, simply because I didn't have a hand to give him that I wanted to see returned. They went down the steps with the slow choreography of people who don't want the scene to end. At the bottom, Luke turned. His mouth opened and closed before any words chose him. Then he shook his head once in a movement so small it might have been a shiver and followed Sienna to the car. I went back inside. I shut the door. The key turned smooth, no quarrel in it, and the bolt seated itself with the same clean click as the first time, only steadier. The house let out a breath. I stood with my back to the wood and my palm flat against it. The grain under my hand felt like a map I finally knew how to read. I returned to the table, to the bright square where winter lay on the surface like a cloth. I lifted the stack of unsigned papers and slid them into the sideboard drawer with the old napkins and the set of birthday candles I keep. Though no one brings cake. In the kitchen I rinsed a cup and set it to dry. When I came back, Martin's chair waited by the window. I took it. Across the street, the mailman leaned into a run against the cold. The maple held its sound as if nothing had happened. The house was the same house, same frames on the mantel, same chip in the far tile, same photograph of Luke's gap-toothed grin, tucked into the corner of the mirror where I could mistake it for today if I wasn't careful. The difference was a thing with neither weight nor color. If you'd come in and asked what changed, I'd have told you to go quiet and listen. You would have heard it in the room's posture. I sat until the light withdrew to the edges of the floor and the first glow from the lamppost across the street claimed a place on my wall. Then I stood, tried the lock once more, and let the bolt answer the question I didn't speak. The bolt gave its clean answer and the house settled around it. I sat a long time at Martin's chair, palms flat on the table, listening to the maples tick against the window and the refrigerator breathe. It was almost dark when the doorbell rang, a sound too polite to belong to trouble. I stood, checked the peephole from habit, and saw a woman my age in a slate-gray coat balancing a foil-covered pan. When I opened the door, she smiled like someone who has learned to lead with kindness, and then wait. "I'm June Carver," she said. "2 doors down. I saw cars earlier. I baked lemon tea bread. It does more good when it leaves my kitchen." "Please," I said, stepping aside. In the warm light of the kitchen, she set the pan on the counter and took a breath the way people do when they're about to risk a truth. "Forgive me if I overstep," she said. "My daughter once arrived with a man who called himself an advisor and laid papers on my table, power of attorney dressed up as the concern. I almost signed. I didn't. It got quieter after it got worse." She touched the foil with 2 fingers. "If I'm wrong about what I saw here this afternoon, tell me, and I'll only leave you cake." "You're not wrong," I said. She nodded like a nurse counting a pulse. "If anyone knocks with a badge and questions, you don't have to answer without counsel. I keep a card in my wallet for people who need it." She slid a business card across the counter. "Rowan Ellis, Elder Law. He's steady, not dramatic. He will stand between you and noise." "Thank you," I said. 2 words too small for the relief I felt. June's eyes went to the new deadbolt, the brushed steel still wearing a faint showroom shine. "Good," she said softly, as if to the metal itself. "That sound, the first time you turn it, it stays." She didn't ask for details. She didn't offer advice dressed as proof. Before she left, she pointed to the yellow legal pad half hidden in the drawer. "Keep writing it down," she said. "Facts don't love anyone, but they stand up in a storm." I slept, and it was the kind of sleep that doesn't ask for permission. Morning found the kitchen the same shape, only easier in its corners. Around 10, the bell rang again, 2 short notes, official and tidy. A woman in a navy coat stood on the porch holding a folder and wearing a badge on a lanyard. "Mrs. Hart," she said. "Marla Benton County Services. We received a report. I'm here for a wellness check." The word report moved through me like a draft under a door. I opened wider. "You may come in," I said, and reached for the card June had left. "But before we talk, I need to make a call." Rowan answered on the second ring. His voice sounded like morning paper, crisp, not hurried. "This is Ellis. This is Evelyn Hart," I said. "You don't know me. My neighbor June Carver gave me your card. A county worker just arrived for a wellness check." "Don't send her away," he said. "Offer coffee." "Say you'd like counsel present. I can be there in 20 minutes. We sat at the table, Ms. Benton paging through her forms, me with the kettle between us, steam like a small flag. I set out 2 cups. She declined hers, then changed her mind and took it black. She glanced around the room in the dutiful way of people who have to note things whether or not they matter. Clean counters, bills stacked, not scattered, a chair with a familiar polish on the arm where a husband's hand once waited. Rowan arrived on the 19th minute and filled the doorway with an unshowy certainty. Tall gray at the temples, glasses that reflected the room and made his eyes look sharper. He shook Miss Benton's hand, took the chair at my side, and set a binder on the table. Before we begin, he said, "Do you have a court order?" "No," she said. "This is voluntary." "Then my client will answer with counsel present," he said, opening the binder. He slid a packet forward. 3 years of bank statements showing outgoing transfers to Mrs. Hart's son and daughter-in-law. A personal ledger itemizing rent assistance, utilities, medical expenses, and taxes Mrs. Hart has covered. A signed acknowledgement from her bank that she has closed standing authorizations. This is not a woman in cognitive decline. This is a woman who has stopped being a purse. Ms. Benton read, "Professionals know when their own paperwork is too thin to stand in a stiff wind." I watched the calculation on her face change from suspicion to verification. The report said she'd become paranoid, she noted without heat. New locks, canceling payments, isolating. Rowan's mouth didn't quite become a smile. New locks are not paranoia, they are locks. He slid over 2 more sheets, recent physical, stable vitals, no medication mismanagement, and if you need a cognitive assessment, I will arrange it within the week. Ms. Benton took a slow sip of coffee. "Mrs. Hart," she said at last, "do you manage your own finances?" "I do," I said. "Do you live independently, drive, prepare meals?" "I do." She set her pen down. "You are not under investigation," she said. "I see no cause for further action." She closed the folder and looked at me as a person, not a case. "If the calls continue, you may refer them to my office. We prefer our hours not to be used as leverage." After she left, Rowan didn't move for a moment. He watched the door the way you watch a stage after the curtain falls, making sure the scene is over. Then he turned back to me softer than his binder. "Someone will escalate," he said. "It tends to follow a pattern." He tapped the legal pad drawer. "You did the most important work before I showed up." I wanted to pretend I didn't know what he meant. I did. The envelope came 2 days later, stiff as a summons and heavier than its weight, petition for guardianship in print, bold enough to announce itself from across the counter. I read it once through, standing again, sitting, and a third time with my palm covering my name, as if the paper might forget whom it meant. Rowan came by with highlighters and calm. "They'll frame this as concern," he said. "We'll meet them with capacity and history." He drew a short list on a yellow sheet, 1, 2, 3, like grocery items anyone might check off. "Neuropsych exam," he said. "Physician letter, pharmacy records. We'll also need a corrected statement if any pharmacist has been ambushed with pre-filled forms." I stared at the word pharmacy until it stopped blurring. I stretched my pills once I said, "When the rent ran high and Luke's hours ran low, that was last winter." "It won't be in the records, but I know it." "Then today you refill," he said simply, as if we had agreed the weather was weather and we would dress for it. I drove to Riverline Pharmacy under a sky the color of a spoon. The bell over the door rang like quarters in a dish. Mr. Patel's square shoulders tired, kindness looked up from his terminal. "Mrs. Hart," he said, recognizing the drill of my habits. "Same medication." "Yes," I said, "this time a 3-month supply." He nodded without surprise. When the paper bag slid across the counter, I held it as if it were an ordinary object, not proof of a decision. "Mr. Patel," I asked, keeping my voice even, "has anyone come asking about my prescriptions?" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "A young woman," he said. "Polite. She brought a form. I believed it was insurance. It asked about irregular purchasing. I noted that you delayed a refill once last year. I didn't intend harm." Rowan took it from there, the way good professionals take a burden without making you feel like one. We met Mr. Patel in the consultation room 2 days later. He typed a careful letter on the company letterhead, dated and signed, stating that the earlier form was presented by a third party, that he had not reviewed the petition context, that in his professional observation I had consistently refilled as prescribed with one documented delay during winter months, common among patients on fixed incomes. He added at Rowan's suggestion that installing a new lock is not clinical evidence of paranoia. If there is a town sport, it is rumor. Mr. Klein across the street had always trimmed his hedges to military posture and his sentences to the point of wound. I heard him before I saw him speaking to a neighbor with his chin lifted, letting the words confused and door and police do their small work. I raised the pharmacy bag a little as I walked from my car to my porch, not for him but for myself, the way you raise a banner before your own eyes to remember what name you march under. The lock received my key and gave the sound I'd learned by heart. The appointment with Dr. Priya Anand took place in a room that had made peace with sunlight. Books lined the walls, spines in rational colors, a rug that looked like it had heard a great many truths and judged none. Dr. Anand shook my hand, then set a legal pad between us, not to take notes sternly, but to give structure to time. This isn't an exam you pass or fail, she said. It's a map. Let's draw it. She asked me what day it was. Tuesday, where we were. Third floor of the medical building on Maple. She read 10 words and asked me to say them back. Orange Penny Chapel window, Dog River lamp, Coat Key garden. I repeated them, felt one slip caught it. She carried on to something else, returned to the list. They came back obedient as a good dog, out of order, but all there. Subtract 7 from 100, she said. 93, 86, 79, 72. I walked down that staircase without tripping. Explain this, she said, offering a proverb. A stitch in time saves 9. Don't delay what you know needs doing. She showed me shapes and asked which didn't belong. Triangle because the others stand on 4 legs. She put a clock face in front of me with no numbers and asked me to draw 10 past 11. My hand made the right angles without asking me for advice. When she was finished, she turned the pad so I could see the sketch of the map we'd made. You are oriented, accurate, and nimble, she said. I will write a report that says so. Rowan gathered the pieces the way a careful man stacks lumber for weather, flat square weight distributed. He prepared a binder for court with tabs labeled so even a hostile gaze could follow them. I, capacity. Tiku. Financial history. 3. Coercion attempts. 4. Corrections of record. He rehearsed nothing with me except the truth. If you are asked why you stopped giving, he said, say you wrote it down and the math finished the sentence. The courthouse on Riverton Square had the smell old buildings keep wood polish paper and undertone of the rain they held out last week. The courtroom itself was less grand than the dramas on television would have you expect. Judge Mercer presided with the quiet of a man who had already listened to 12 families before lunch. On the other side sat Luke in a stiff gray suit and Sienna in a dress the color of snow when it's new and won't be new for long. Adam Hale arranged his papers with the performance of an orchestra conductor about to cue a modest overture. Your Honor, Hale began. This is a matter of care, not conflict. My clients have observed changes in Mrs. Hart's behavior, impulsive financial decisions, isolation, security, fixation. They seek a limited guardianship to ensure her well-being. He called Sienna. She spoke with a softness that gripped its own wrists. Evelyn has always been generous, she said, eyes bright, the way stage lights are bright. Recently she's been unpredictable. She canceled payments. She changed locks suddenly. She refused reasonable help. Rowan stood without hurrying. Ms. Carver, he said, when was the last time you visited Mrs. Hart without asking for assistance of any kind? She blinked as if the sun had stepped out from behind a cloud. We are a family, she said. We don't track like that. A date will do, Rowan said. I don't recall. Did you tell Mrs. Hart she was not invited to your wedding because it was just our people? Her jaw set. It was small and private. Was she present? No, she said, and for the first time her voice admitted what her posture denied. Rowan called Luke. My son raised his hand, swore, and avoided my face as if it might hold an answer he couldn't use. You've received money from your mother over the last 3 years, Rowan asked. Luke shifted. Sometimes, he said, when we needed it. Rowan held up a copy of my ledger. Would you read the total at the bottom? Luke stared. Each second felt like a page turning in a book no one wanted. 67,080, he said at last. In that time, Rowan asked, how often did you visit her, simply to visit? Luke's throat moved. Not often, he said, a man choosing the smallest truth he could find. Rowan laid out the binder as if setting a table. Dr. Anand's report, first capacity intact, no cognitive impairment. My physician's letter stable, independent. Mr. Patel's correction earlier statement signed, under misapprehension. Adherence consistent. The bank records and Mr. Pierce's cancellation confirmations. Then he placed my legal pad photocopy face up on the stand. Mrs. Hart, he said, what is this? My ledger, I said. And why did you stop the payments? Because I wrote it down, I said. And when I read what I'd written, the answer was already there. Hale objected tone and timing more than substance. Your Honor, this is a family matter. We do not contest Mrs. Hart's generosity. We question her recent judgment. Judge Mercer took off his glasses and polished them with a square of cloth he must have kept for that purpose alone. When he spoke, his voice was thin as paper and twice as strong. Judgment, he said, is not a synonym for obedience. He turned a few pages, took his time with the letters that mattered, and looked out over the rims at Luke and Sienna. Mrs. Hart is competent, he said. The pattern before the court suggests not incapacity, but exploitation that she has now declined to continue. He set the glasses back on his nose. Petition denied. The gavel's knock was not thunder. It was wood on wood, a sound so ordinary you could miss it if you were busy pretending not to hear. Hale stacked his papers neatly to hide the lack of a place to put the last sentence he'd prepared. Sienna's lips pressed white. Luke stared at the table as if it had failed him. Rowan touched my elbow once, a gentleman's affirmation and not a victory dance. In the hallway, light pooled on the marble like something you could dip your hands into and come away steadier. Rowan handed me a manila envelope. Certified copies, he said. One for your files, one for the bank, one for your insurance agent if needed. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice to ride the first word without wobbling. Outside, the air had the clear cold of a day that had decided what it was. Cars moved where they needed to move. People crossed where they had to cross. I carried the envelope against my ribs. Back home, the house opened as it always did. I closed the door. The key turned and the bolt made that certain faithful sound. I stood at the table and set the envelope beside the blue pot. Then I pulled out the chair across from Martin's and let the quiet take its rightful seat. I set the manila envelope beside the blue pot, then sat in Martin's chair and let the quiet settle where it belonged. Outside, the lamppost took its small place on my wall. I could taste metal from the courthouse air paper dust and polish, but it faded under the steam from the kettle. The house was itself again. Same maple at the window, same scuff on the kitchen tile, same hairline crack in the plaster above the clock. I looked at the entryway and saw the one thing still wearing another person's fingerprints, the green side door with its keypad numbers from Luke's Little League year. I picked up the phone and called Daly & Son locksmiths. Mr. Daly arrived with a canvas bag and a patience that didn't need to be advertised. He walked the perimeter with me, front side, kitchen door to the yard, listened when I said everything. He swapped cylinders, reset the keypad, replaced 2 plates that had been loose since Clinton. He worked without commentary as if locks were just sentences that needed clearer punctuation. When he finished, he handed me a ring of new keys heavy enough to count as proof. You'll want to turn each one, he said. We did one by one. The front door took the key and answered with a sure click. The kitchen door followed suit, then the side door, now free of Luke's numbers. At the end, Mr. Daly nodded once, the blessing of a man who respects finished work, and carried his bag to the truck that smelled faintly of cedar shavings. The house breathed differently. I made tea and carried it to the porch in the blue pot Martin chose at a church rummage sale because the handle fit his hand. The jasmine was soft and clean. Across the street, Mr. Klein trimmed his hedge to attention and pretended not to look. I let him have his quiet show. A girl coasted past on a scooter, one foot dragging a happy line of rubber. The world held. A knock touched the door like a polite question. June Carver stood there with a cloth bag and that patient smile. I brought your pan back, she said, lifting it, and invitations cost nothing. She set the bag on my counter, envelopes of seeds, labeled in tidy script marigold, dill, zinnia, rubber bands around paper packets like little promises. We meet on Wednesdays at the Civic Center, she said. We trade seeds, sometimes stories, no speeches. Let me get my coat, I said. The basement smelled of potting soil and lemon cleaner. Folding chairs made a circle that fit without squeaking. A dozen women filled it, Alma with a braid thick as rope, Noreen with a laugh that started in her chest, 2 sisters who finished each other's sentences. June introduced me and left space around my name the way a good host leaves elbow room at a table. Someone passed a tin of butter cookies. Someone else set a thermos of coffee without asking who wanted cream. We spoke in the language of ordinary things. Alma taught me how to pinch basil without scolding it. Noreen talked about her windowsill tomatoes like they were shy cousins. When talk strayed near money, near children, near the way doors opened and closed, no one pressed for details. Heads simply nodded in a rhythm older than any of us. A woman named Ruth pulled a spiral notebook from her purse columns of dates and sums, a private ledger kept in careful hand. She didn't hold it up. She just rested her palm on it and breathed easier. On the way home, Juna pressed a packet into my coat pocket. Calendula, she said, sturdy. We parted at her walkway with a plain goodnight, no extra weight. At my kitchen table, I slid the envelope of certified copies into the drawer with the yellow pad and closed it gently. I set the seed packet on the sill beside Martin's photograph. He wore the same crooked tie and steady mouth he'd worn the day the bank gave us the mortgage because the loan officer liked the way Martin said thank you. I took down a sheet of cream paper and his old fountain pen. Dear Martin. I wrote and the nib remembered the path. The words came without ceremony. I stood where I needed to stand. The judge read what he needed to read. I changed the side door code. The blue pot still pours like rain. The maple is loud this winter. I take my pill with water when the clock says, your chair holds. I stopped there. The letter didn't need an ending. Letters to the dead borrow their endings from the room. I folded the page twice and slid it into the wooden box that keeps our small reliquary. His watch, a scrap of ribbon, the receipt from the hardware store the year we fixed the porch rail. The box fit back on the shelf between the cookbook with gravy on 2 pages and the album with corners gone soft, from decades of telling the same stories to the same faces. When I checked the locks, the house answered like a calm horse steady under the hand. I turned off lights until the rooms were only what they needed. In the bedroom, the windows held a narrow slice of moon. On the nightstand, the orange bottle caught a square of lamplight and gave it back exactly. I swallowed the tablet and lay down without arranging tomorrow into anything. Morning started as it always does. Kettle toast the news low enough to ignore if it tried too hard. On the sill, calendula waited in its paper coat. I pressed a shallow trench into potting soil and tucked the seeds in 3 small suns, disappearing into a dark they trusted. The little axe settled in my hands. When June knocked later, 2 soft taps, neighbor sure, I left the door open the width of a hand while I fetched my scarf. Cold air came in, clean as linen. The lock held. The blue pot stayed warm on the counter. I stepped back to the door, pulled it to, and let the bolt find its home. The sound traveled through the wood and into the room, a quiet note, certain enough. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.